everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Pallavito. I'll be your moderator today, and we have a very big topic to discuss. Probably the biggest part of the discretionary budget. Notice I use the word discretionary budget, and it's the defense budget of the United States of America. Well over $800 billion. So with that, we brought in our esteemed panelists to discuss this $800 billion budget issue. And first of all, we're going to bring in a member of the Mega Society, hailing from Southern California, former writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live, Rick Rosner. I'm sure you're going to have some interesting insights into this $800 billion plus budget. From the Washington, D.C. area, we have two important panelists, one who is a former military officer, colonel, and also a doctorate. He's actually on our shows a lot. We're going to bring in the Honorable Dr. John Lockwood. I'm sure you're going to have something interesting to say about the military budget.
I always do.
For a long time. And then the budget man himself, the person who is the former Comptroller General of the United States, the sponsor of the show. We're going to bring in the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm sure you're going to have some interesting things to say about this $800 billion budget. And joining us from Utah, another doctorate. We're like heavy in the doctorate department today. We're going to bring in Dr. Dan Worthington from Utah. So I think we're going to start with you, John, since you're in or close to the military, have been in it for a long time. I read through the budget as it was presented, that 175-page document. And frankly, there was no meat in those potatoes. So I had to go to other sources like the Peterson Institute, which David Walker used to work for, that actually did break down what are we spending the money on. Right? The budget just says, okay, here's $800 billion. Okay, great, $800 billion. Where does this money all go to? It's a lot of money. There was one demographic I saw that we spend more on military than 10 other countries combined. So, Dr. Lockwood, where does this $800 billion go that we're borrowing money to pay this huge?
Well, Nick, the problem with that $800 billion figure is there does not appear to be a real concrete overarching strategy, such as we had during the Cold War when we had the grand strategy of containment, which at least provided a grand strategic framework within which then dictated the priorities for our military spending. The problem is when you don't have a clear structured foreign policy framework that states the priorities of how we are going to spend all of this money on the military, you end up with a situation where, pretty much more of everything is better, which imposes no upper limit on military spending. That is irrational. And what it does is it leads to essentially a situation where things are out of control and the services are all competing with each other for a bigger and bigger piece of an ever-growing pie, which cannot grow indefinitely. It cannot grow to an infinite degree. And so the whole thing of this, the premise of this discussion is, where do we cut? It's actually asking the wrong question. It should be, what are the true grand strategic priorities of the United States and the West, which dictate an overall strategy for dealing with potential near peer adversaries such as Russia and China and lesser rogue state adversaries. And unless we have that, and we have a clear-cut set of spending priorities, we cannot really begin to address what do we spend all of this money on. By the way, most of which is money we don't really have, because we're spending like we have an unlimited credit card. Mm-hmm. And so it just becomes insane. I'm sure Rick will agree with me on this, that what is that Rick, you certainly address this, is that what is desperately needed is a reprioritization of our strategic priorities in line with a clear-cut foreign policy, which then should dictate how we go about spending our resources.
Right.
Yeah. let me start at the top. We do have a national security strategy. We do have a national defense strategy, but it has not been rationalized. It needs to be rationalized given the realities of changing alliances in the world, our limitations with regard to finances. We need to better define what is in the critical national security interest of the United States first. Secondly, what is in the critical interest of the United States from a global security standpoint. But quite frankly, we try to do too much, and we need to reprioritize. And there's a number of things I think that, specifically, I think we need to do below that as to how we can get more with less. Because I do think that the Pentagon has become a bloated bureaucracy. I think a number of our current platforms do not make sense for the likely future fight. I think the current all-volunteer force and the compensation policies associated with it are not sustainable over the long term. I think we need to revise our acquisition and contracting practices, and I'm happy to get into the details in each of these. I'm just giving you kind of a headline right now. And frankly, I think one of the things that we need to consider in this country is mandatory national service, mandatory national public service, of which the military would be an option, but not the only option. So those are just a few thoughts right off the top, and we can drill down. But I know Rick's got his hand up.
So the best way to cut the military budget is to not be at war. Right now, we're spending about 3.4% of the GDP, I think, on military. During times of war, it goes as high as 8%. So here's some other numbers. The U.S. has about 750 foreign military bases in 80 countries around the world, with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. Trump tried to pull us back from a lot of that, but Trump is America's worst businessman. He went bankrupt. You take a look at some of the stuff Trump wanted to do and maybe do the opposite.
Well, I do think that we need to rationalize our force structure. We need to rationalize our footprint. And part of that comes back to what Jonathan said before. I mean, we need to reprioritize, what our national security strategy ought to be. And I don't think we've done that adequately. We're trying to do too much, and we're already overstretched, and it's going to get tougher as we move forward.
When we pull back, other countries, particularly China, step in. Under Trump, we stopped trying to be the world's friend as much, and then China stepped in with its vast resources and started increased. I could be wrong about anything I'm saying here, but that they reached out with much more aid to other countries.
Well, first, let's understand that China has a strategic plan and we don't. China has a strategic plan designed to promote their economic, diplomatic, military, and cultural capabilities. The big part of that strategic plan is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And they are out there aggressively trying to do that, not just in their region, but in Africa, in South America, and other parts of the world. We don't have such a plan, which is one of the fundamental problems. The other thing is that, we have alliances, but those alliances don't always live up to their obligation. One example is NATO. We do way more than our fair share with regard to NATO. We're doing more than our fair share with regard to Ukraine. And yet now we've got a situation, in Israel where we're going to step up. But that is another resource drain as well.
Dave, just out of curiosity, because I know that there's been conversation, I'm actually going to switch to a different part of the world and everything, about the use of our military in Central and Latin America? I know that there have been some campaign folks that have brought that up on the Republican side and all along those lines. And I know that there is definitely a concern about the drugs that are coming in, whether it's fentanyl or whether it's some of the more illicit drugs from those countries and everything. But is that a realistic approach, and won't that also drain our military forces should we choose to do that? Because I want to say that both Nikki Haley and Vivek have brought that up as a subject matter within their Republican platforms and all along those lines. So I'm just wondering your thoughts, because Latin America is a very that's literally in our backyard. Some of these other countries, whether it's Africa or even the Middle East, are further away. Not saying that they aren't of interest, because they are of very vital interest in everything, but there is things that are happening literally in our backyard. And I was just wondering, do we need to have those governments handle their own problems and help them in that process, or is this military option a viable option?
Well, let me mention something, and then I know James had his hand up, so we can go to him next. Look, I think the issue that you're talking about, Mark, deals with the drug cartels in Mexico and their activities associated with human smuggling and with drug smuggling. In my personal opinion, that is a public health and a national security threat. No ifs, ands, or buts. Anybody who says that the border is secure is lying. It's nowhere close to being secure. You have a difficult situation for the Mexican government because the drug cartels are very wealthy and very powerful, and they are also ruthless. In my personal opinion, they should be declared to be terrorist organizations. In my personal opinion, we should work with Mexico to try to take them out. And if Mexico will not do it, and we can provide support with intelligence and a variety of other things, then I think we should be prepared to do it. That is a clear national security and public health threat for the United States that I think is a clear and present danger. But that's different than the rest of Latin America. I mean, for the most part, we don't have the same type of issues with regard to the rest of Latin America. And of course, we've long had something called the Monroe Doctrine, where we want foreign powers to be able to keep their hands off of countries that are in our hemisphere to varying degrees of success, as evidenced by the blockade of Cuba in 1963. That the Russians, were where we confronted the Russians and ultimately were successful in that regard. But I know James has had his hand up for a while. So
thank you, Dave. Yeah, I want to start out by saying I think your patriotism is unquestioned, and your cry for rationalism is I fully support. So I don't want to be seen as disagreeing with you. However, when we were talking about China having a plan and we don't, although that's true, China's plan is not necessarily a good one. And that also the difference is with whether we're talking about military and defense expenditures, or are we talking about economics? And I think, for example, if there's rare earths in Africa and China's all over that, and the U.S. is lagging behind that kind of stuff, that's a problem. But I see that as an economic problem, and something different than what we were talking about is how do we rein in our military spending? One is to make it more rational, including the fact that we're no longer as invested in ground troops as we used to be. And sometimes when we advance our military's capability to make more sophisticated weaponry, which is required in today's world, we make obsolete some other things. And what we still employ people in the military to maintain and to support those and to train on those obsolete things. So my thinking is that we don't need as much as a ground force, and maybe we don't need as many people active, and maybe we should be making more and more of these people reserves and increasing the reserve capacity of these people. Let them go back into the economy, do things that might benefit society in other ways, and be on call in case there is an emergency. But they continue to invest in today's world, which is long range. There's no heroism in today's wars. It's not face to face. You don't see your enemy's eyes. This is the kind of stuff that we're going to be building in the future. And we need ships to be able to move them around. We need Air Force. We need long range missiles. But we don't need the traditional ground force as much as we used to.
Well, I think it comes back to what we started with at the onset of this conversation. We need to redefine what our current and likely future threats are. We need to reprioritize what's in our direct and indirect national security interest. When you talk about China having a plan, keep in mind that many of these things affect all dimensions. I mean, when you talk about rare earth materials, those aren't just an economic issue. They're a military issue, because a lot of those rare earth materials aren't just used for the purposes of, let's say, for example, prescription drugs. They're also used for weapon systems. And so, their plan may not be perfect. And by definition, it's not perfect, because there's no plan that's perfect. But it's better to have a plan than to be running by the seat of your pants when you consider that your plan is your annual budget, which you've only passed on time with all the appropriations bills 4 times in 72 years. Okay, so there's a degree of dysfunction here that we've got to deal with. I do think, coming back real quick, that we need to relook at our strategy. We need to look at what does that mean with regard to the type of force structure that we have, with regard to the footprint that we have, not just in the United States, but around the world. Force structure meaning both active as well as guard and reserve. Okay, we need to look at it with regard to our platforms. The truth is that more and more warfare in the future is going to be fought with unmanned vehicles. We now have total visibility of the battlefield, except for underwater. That's the only thing that you don't have total visibility. We have a number of platforms that we've spent a tremendous amount of money on that we're very proud of. For example, aircraft carriers. But in today's warfare situation, there's another word for them. It's called targets. And so we need to really step back and not just focus on what we've had and what we have, but what we need and how we transition to that as we go forward.
And Dave, I agree with you, particularly on it. We're very proud of our aircraft carriers, yes, and they in turn provide a center of gravity, which in turn become a set of targets. Also, we have a U.S. Space Force, but which, again, good idea in concept, but the U.S. Space Force, according to open sources, consists of 80 satellites, no space fleet. But what Russia and China do not consider that a space force. They consider that a set of 80 targets, which need to be disrupted or exploited with their own counter space capabilities. That becomes another consideration in how we restructure. And so we have to look at, if we cut back on certain services, do we then build up the U.S. Space Force by giving it a space fleet, a manned space fleet, which could perform a number of planetary defense missions as well as national security missions for the U.S. and NATO? Where would you get the space fleet? You buy it from SpaceX, is the short answer. And you could then use that as a new source for what I would call a strategy of asymmetric response, or as the Russians would call it, strategia asymmetricheskaya reagирования. So that it becomes, if you cut back, there is an opportunity to spend not so much on other capabilities like the U.S. Space Force to create new capabilities which would better address our strategic priorities.
If you're going to buy from SpaceX, you got to make sure that Elon Musk isn't crazy. Like his behavior with Twitter, Elon Musk has gotten about $5 billion in funding from the government. And he's good at space, but company needs to have rational governance.
Right, Rick. Here's the thing with SpaceX. Essentially with what I'm advocating, the SpaceX has certain platforms. It has the Falcon 9, it has the Falcon Heavy, and it has the Starship. Now, the Starship, when you look at it really closely about its capabilities, where Elon Musk wants to take that Starship and send colonists to Mars on it, I'm tempted to say to Elon, are you effing crazy? Are you not going to put 100 colonists, which he advocates, on a chemically powered Starship, which would take 6 to 7 months to get to Mars, and which people looking at the capabilities of that Starship realistically say, that Starship could support a crew of 10 for a long-term basis with proper resupply. That makes the Starship really lousy for Martian colonization. But guess what? You buy those platforms and you add proper weapons, equipment, and capability to it, and it makes a great starter space fleet for the U.S. Space Force, capable of performing multiple missions in low Earth orbit and on the moon.
Agreed.
So-
Toby's had his hands up.
Go ahead.
You're on mute, Toby. You're on mute.
Toby,
Muted.
Just to point out, the Space Force became a joke on Netflix for this reason itself.
yeah.
It is not really plausible and it's not really a legitimate idea. The reason that SpaceX actually tries to distance its name from Elon is because of his antics and how poorly he has treated Twitter, and people have actually come to know that Elon really hasn't created anything. He's just bought stuff and talked about it. So Elon isn't the greatest idea, or even with Tesla. Tesla's stock dropped when Elon's voice became louder and louder. So Space Force, that is a poor investment because war in itself is changing. That's where AI is coming into play. That's where all this other technology is coming into play. And I think, David, you are spot on with talking about our strategic changes, is because we have to look at the evolution of war and the evolution of technology and not focus on these idealistic, we need more tanks. Well, what about the electronics that can be hacked within that tank? You can use an AI bot to just take over that. What about, you're talking about Space Force, and that can all be done. I mean, somebody sitting at home can actually hack into one of the channels and find out what the camera capabilities of a satellite is. So all that stuff, that's where the whole technological and the evolution of war is. And I think, David, again, looking at where our money is spent, and honestly thinking about historically, when we go into war, what we end up doing is we go in, we blow up stuff and leave, and not think about the humanitarian aid and all that vacuum that happens. What Rick had brought up is that, yes, when we leave, other countries come in. And that's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened in Iran. That's what happened in Afghanistan. All the places that we go in and leave out of, we don't drop in and keep that humanitarian aid. We don't keep that force there to make sure that certain groups don't come into play.
Well,
honestly, I think it was Fareed Zakaria did a great piece on Sunday talking about how this vacuum was created by ourselves when we came in and did that in the Middle East.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other ventures. Afghanistan, we were justified in going in to try to neutralize Al-Qaeda and to try to topple the Taliban, who was supporting Al-Qaeda. We should have been out of Afghanistan a long time ago, and we should have done it the right way. We also don't do a very good job of learning from history and learning from others. Afghanistan has been a problem for a number of major powers over time. It was even a problem for Genghis Khan. It was a problem for the British. It was a problem for the Russians. Quite frankly, who the hell do we think we are to be able to go into Afghanistan, which is basically a bunch of tribes? It is not a cohesive country, and think that we're going to convert it to a modern democracy. It was totally ridiculous. Let's transition to Iraq. Our son fought in Iraq as a Marine Corps officer. Unfortunately, he's fine, mentally and physically. but we went into Iraq under false pretenses. We went into Iraq saying that they were allied with Al Qaeda and that they were harboring lots of weapons of mass destruction. It turns out that neither was true. And yet one of our objectives was to topple the government. I'm talking about a legitimate government, not a good government, but a legitimate government, unlike the Taliban. Okay. And yet we didn't declare a war. So the purpose was to topple the government and to defeat a country, and yet we didn't declare a war, and we eliminated a bad guy, Saddam Hussein, no question. There's a lot of bad people in the world, but we eliminated one of them. But when we did that, we left a vacuum, because Saddam Hussein, as bad as he was a check and balance on Iran.
Yeah.
The elimination of the check and balance on Iran, we now created another vacuum, if you will. So again, I come back to say we need to step back and we need to focus on what are our current and future threats. What are things that are a direct national security interest of the United States? What are the things that are indirect? What are the relative priorities? When should we commit forces and not commit forces? This is just very fundamental. Okay. But I'm happy to get into some specifics about what are some of the things that I think we need to do to deal with the budget. But it starts with strategy.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Without a strategy, you have no clearly definable upper limit. That's the whole problem.
Right. Yeah. Without a plan, you're going nowhere fast.
Speaking of plans and strategy and everything, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say there was 2 Iraq wars. The first one, Desert Storm.
Yeah.
That had a mission, and that was also, we had allies, and once we accomplished,
and believe it or not, James, we made money on that war. That's not something we want to do as a line of business, but we did.
And so it's not just outright failure, but yes, we were lied to. I think Dick Cheney, the second Bush president's ear was just turned by people that were telling him what they wanted him to believe, and he ended up believing it and then presenting it to the public. I think Colin Powell, who's a hero, was lied to and then got on camera and lied, and I think his career was forever ruined because he was an epitome of honesty in the military leadership, and now people couldn't trust him after that. So, we had these examples, but there was also The Ugly American was written back in the 50s when we were in Southeast Asia, and we didn't understand the cultures that we were in, and we made a mess of things. So, we went into Afghanistan. Of course, that was crazy to think that we can nation build there. We armed and trained the Afghan army for 20 years. And as soon as we got out, they laid down their arms and let the Taliban walk in. And if they were like the Ukraine fighters and stood up to them, they wouldn't have gotten an inch closer. But they weren't, because the Taliban were the Afghans. They were people that they trusted, not the Americans. So when the Americans go into a culture that they have no clue about, they don't understand, they will mess it up. So get in and get out. A mission accomplished is what we want, but not the type where we're parachuting into a boat and saying mission accomplished when it isn't.
And now we have some of the weapons that were left in Afghanistan showing up in Gaza.
Precisely.
I'd contend that one of the most cost-effective way to maintain an effective military strength is technological superiority. Anybody who reads science fiction or anybody really knows that a lot of the future conflicts are going to be fought by those crazy mechanical dogs that come out of Boston Dynamics and other kinds of robots. Drones are way cheaper than full-on fighter jets. And technological superiority also means building the knowledge and expertise pipeline by pushing education the way we did in the 60s and 70s.
And I think one of the big things that Jim had typed, honestly, was it Jim? Yeah, I think it was Jim. Yeah, typed how everything is intertwined. I mean, it is very true. Yeah, education, Rick, needs to be pushed more because, I mean, there's just, if you want to hit that Space Force, you have to be able to build those actual ships to be able to get there. That all starts with technology. NASA's been cut. NASA's the one that really created a lot of this stuff that we're utilizing, but we're cutting out NASA. And then in terms of intertwine, if we want to upgrade the power grid, which needs to be upgraded, guess what? That's still on that technology end because our power grid can be hacked and taken over quickly. It's just everything is truthfully intertwined, but we forget that we still go in that mindset. And I mean that the old war is what it is. Military might is all it is. I mean, on a chessboard, you can outthink somebody with less pieces. In any battle, you can outthink somebody with less men. It's just if you're able to outthink and out-strategize and out-plan, you can win whatever war comes into play.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Speaking of planning and everything, I had a quick question for Dave and all along, Dave Walker.
Right.
Because one of the things that we've been talking about in this whole conversation around economics and around the military is the notion of the spy network and the conversation that goes on. Even with this recent attack on Hamas, there has been a lot of conversation about how they knew about this attack before it took place. I mean, that was the same conversation I remember from 9/11 and all along those lines. So how much of this interwoven network is a true network? I mean, I've read enough spy novels to know that that's supposed to be existing, but then we hear about these miscommunications or these warnings that are given that are ignored for whatever reason. So I was just wondering your thoughts around that, because I have heard definitely that there were even some Middle Eastern nations, I want to say Egypt, that had said, look, this is about to happen. Y'all need to be prepared for it and all along those lines. So how interwoven is that true network that we hear about all the time?
Well, first, it's very clear that there were intelligence failures associated with the incursion into Israel. The assertion is that Egypt had some suspicions that something was going to happen. How concrete of evidence they had, I don't know, and that they tried to bring that to the attention of Israel, and it wasn't acted on appropriately. Again, I don't know the details, so it's difficult to be able to comment. I will say that it's also evident that the United States, Israel, and others have relied a lot more on signals intelligence and on technology rather than human intelligence. HUMINT is what it's called, SIGINT, HUMINT. And in this particular case, what happened was Hamas took advantage of that. They went low tech. They went exactly the opposite. There were only very few people in Hamas that even knew what was going on. They did not communicate using using electronics, and as a result, were able to surprise the Israelis. They also came in on a holy day, so you weren't totally prepared. Although Israel should know that when looking back in history, that's what they tend to do. I mean, if somebody's going to attack, they tend to come in on a holy day, if you will. So we'll get a lot of lessons learned out of that. But I agree that technology is key to competitiveness, but there are limitations to technology. And technology is not always the answer to every situation. Let me, if I can, go back to some of the things that when I did the 10 million a minute tour in 2012 to 27 states, 10,000 miles, and engaged with the American people around the country, some of the things that we talked about and that the public agreed to with 80+% support of the kinds of things that we need to do with regard to defense. I'll come back to where we started. We need a strategy that is based upon current and future threats. All right. We also need to make sure that when we're planning our requirements, you have to consider cost. Right now, they don't have to consider cost. Here's what we need. Don't worry about the cost. Okay. We need to recognize that the so-called tail, which is overhead and support, has grown much faster than the tooth. In fact, the tooth, which is warfighting capability, has shrunk, and the tail has grown multiple times. And so we need to cut the tail so we can sharpen the teeth. And to do that, we're going to need a BRAC type approach to deal with the bureaucracy. We need to rationalize our footprint, and that's going to take a BRAC approach, both domestically and internationally. We need to rethink our platforms, based upon current and future threats. We need to do acquisition and contracting reform. We tried, the Defense Department tries, they have a dream. Here's my dream. This is what we'd like to have. Okay. But it's not necessarily based upon current and future threats. It's not necessarily affordable and sustainable. They keep on changing the requirements, which means it's going to take longer, cost more. So we need to nail down the requirements, make sure that we can afford the requirements. We need to have our contracts, whereas if you don't perform on time, on budget, with appropriate performance, you don't get any bonuses. We're giving bonuses to people that are late, over budget, and don't perform what we've asked them to do. And in many cases,
you're looking essentially at a trend towards firm fixed cost contracts, which would be
or either shared or either sharing in the risk much more than we do right now. Okay.
Right. If I may comment just on one aspect of where I agree with you and a number of other people that technology is the key, because based on my analysis of the Russian view of U.S. strategy over the past several decades, the one thing I have discovered is that the thing that the Russians leadership fears more than anything else, even though they won't come out and admit it directly, is that they fear the potential of U.S. technology to neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power in its own perception,
nuclear,
and that is its nuclear missile arsenal.
Right.
They have been fearful of the potential of U.S. technology ever since the mid-1980s with the declaration of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the U.S. deployed the Patriot system, for heaven's sake, they were fearful of the potential of Patriot as early as 1985. And now, several decades later, when we see the performance of Patriot in the Russia-Ukraine war, where the Patriot has a near 100% interception rate, this foreshadows the potential of ballistic missile defense in a national global ballistic missile defense system, which I advocate regularly on Sasha's show, that the U.S. should join together with NATO in order to neutralize future Russian threats and, by extension, Chinese threats, Iranian threats, North Korean threats, devise a global ballistic missile defense system that can neutralize the nuclear arsenals and render, in the words of the late President Ronald Reagan, render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. That is a concrete goal. Because, as I've also discovered, the more that you introduce ballistic missile defense into the strategic equation, the more you increase uncertainty in the minds of your opponents as to how successful a potential use of nuclear weapons will be. A potential attacker, in the face of a robust ballistic missile defense system, does not know how many of his missiles will get through. He does not know which ones will get through. What the aggressor does know, such as Russia, is that if his nuclear strike should fail in its objective, that he would be subjected to a massive nuclear counterstrike by U.S. and NATO nuclear forces. Yeah. So this is why I would advocate, this is one of the cores of my strategy of asymmetric response. That is the framework. You look for ways in which you can neutralize specific items of power that are of importance to your opponent. Then once Rick, in agreement with what you would do, once you have neutralized certain aspects, then you can afford to safely cut back on the more offensive portions of or outdated portions of your military arsenal and achieve savings and cost effectiveness that way. But the key is to know what the perception of your opponent is and what they value and what they rely upon as the potential source of leverage for their use of military forces.
I think it's realistic. Let me just comment real quick. I think it's realistic to do something with regard to strategic nuclear weapons along the lines of what you're talking about. I would argue to a great extent they're not viable now because of mutually assured destruction. Okay. The real challenge is going to be tactical nuclear weapons. And in particular, that's an issue I think that could arise in Ukraine in certain circumstances. But go ahead. Others had their hands up.
in the mid to long term, you're going to have to come up with more efficient ways to get stuff into orbit. The most expensive part of building a platform in space is the cost of launching stuff off the Earth. So in the next 100 years, we're going to need to build a space elevator where you lift stuff up, or maybe an equatorial launch ramp, which lowers the cost. And eventually you're going to have to clean up space. There's a bunch of junk up there, and you can't have a functioning platform if random orbiting junk is going to crash into your stuff.
So I think their end was where it should start, because throwing anything in space at this moment, you're going to end up getting destroyed just because the amount of junk that we've thrown around the Earth and that's sitting in orbit. They are creating new, I think, fission engines now, which are supposed to be able to lift off a little bit better. But I mean, there's a whole jet propulsion stuff. I do a lot of Star Talk stuff, which is really cool because they talk about a bunch of different things. But either way, but yeah, the big thing. I mean, it sounds like you're talking about putting an Iron Dome, similar to the way Israel has over Hamas. That's what it sounded like. But the tough part about that is who's going to be running that, and who decides which countries become those aggressors, and where do you stick that ballistic? It just becomes super complicated, I think, and becomes very tough, because what happens when that gets hacked, and then we become seen as that aggressor? Because again, AI is coming, and within the next 5 years, you don't know who's going to be controlling that AI. And if an aggressor has that AI and is able to actually create that bot that actually takes over whatever you put up there, and you don't have the technological base or the coding backing to be able to protect that, it's useless. So a lot of the technology and the education portion, I always lean back to that, because again, seeing the advent of AI and how fast it's come, because if you take historically speaking again, the horse and buggy was replaced by the car. The horse and buggy used to be there for thousands of years, but the car is now being replaced. I mean, the way the car is being replaced and evolved over the past, we won't even say 100 years, because, Ford created the first car back in 1902. So therefore you're looking at over, less than 100 years, we've already hit EV vehicles and jets and everything else that have taken off the planet. So the evolution of everything is moving at a rapid pace. Yeah. And now with AI coming into play,
I think going back to what Jonathan said.
This is Steve Rao. Absolutely. I just was listening today. I always love to listen to Dave Walker, but I recently was at a DOT conference last week on advanced mobility, all talking about drones and maritime technologies. And we often think of transit and transportation with roads, but there's a lot of innovation occurring in the space. I think it's important for us to factor in how that figures into our defense systems, how this figures into wars. I think that I know Dave Walker has written a book called, Will America Be a Superpower? But I think the one thing I will say is that I think today we become a dysfunctional superpower. I mean, we don't have a Speaker of the House. We're in the middle of 2 wars. I think our foreign policy is a little bit, people are very confused right now what this is all going to mean. And in Raleigh, just yesterday, there was huge protests, peaceful protests from the Palestinian community. So, I find that to be kind of, I have to treat it with kid gloves as a political leader as well, because we want to also know that, there's innocent civilians from Palestine dying. And this war, this dispute's been going on since World War I. And it's surfaced again. And I think that it's just a really tough situation. And hopefully we can, but we can't even fund a war now because we don't have a speaker.
Yeah.
We don't have a Congress.
There's no question that we're dysfunctional now, and our current situation is an embarrassment, quite frankly. And I think it's primarily the Republicans, but not exclusively. I think the Democrats could have helped.
They didn't,
and they didn't. Right? So it's just just another example of partisanship on both sides. But let me mention one thing. I think what Jonathan was talking about with regard to some type of defensive mechanism, the most effective way to deal with that is either from space or to forward deploy those to the countries that you're close to, the countries you're concerned about potentially using their weapons, rather than trying to decentralize and deploy them all around the world.
Yeah, that is correct, David.
Right.
Essentially, with a global ballistic missile defense system, which would be operated essentially by the U.S. and its NATO allies, what you are doing is you are using that to selectively protect certain priority targets and be able to prevent countries like Russia or Iran, for that matter,
China.
or China, yes, for those with nuclear arsenals who are attempting to use their nuclear arsenals as their means of political leverage to be able to use their military power more effectively. Once you neutralize the nuclear arsenals, you have removed a major component asymmetrically. It's a no-kill strategy. That's the beautiful part of it.
So,
Ballistic missile defense systems do not kill anyone. They destroy leverage.
I don't think we can negotiate with Russia right now, but in the past, arms reduction has been pretty effective, where the U.S. Soviet Union reduced the number of deployable nukes from many thousands, like 6,000, to, it's hard to get solid numbers, but maybe 1,600 apiece today, which is still way too many.
Yeah, you can still ruin your day.
Right, but if someday a non-crazy person is running Russia, we can negotiate with that person and reduce the number further.
So the issue, I think this becomes a geopolitical issue where people, so for example, what's happening in Israel, and how you have you have a lot of the Arab nations upset at the way Israel is handling the Palestinian individuals. So because they're seeing them being ethnically cleansed, and they're seeing them being moved out of where they are. There's also the UN I think it was the UN or somebody had pointed out that telling 1.1 million people to move is tantamount to a war crime. So having one centralized unit handling the global defense of this one area, sure, you can say, oh, well, the U.S. and its UN allies, but does that create more hatred towards the U.S. being seen as the military or the arbiter of what's right and wrong in the world, rather than actually doing, like Rick said, being able to negotiate one-on-one? I understand
That's the way it's always going to be, Jacoby. That's the way it's always going to be.
I was just going to finish this comment real quick, and I'll let you go. Because currently, the negotiations where we were able to do the reduction, yes, it helped. When we actually had the Iran deal in there, it helped some. So the personal negotiations there. But would we then be seen as, hey, we're holding a gun to you to accept our deal on our terms, rather than negotiations being on equal playing field?
Yeah, no, you just expressed an opinion that shows your naivete about how the world works and how world power works.
Please don't say that I'm naive in that manner. We're both on equal playing fields here. Neither of us are geopolitical leaders.
But I have a lot more. I have a lot more experience and understanding about how the world works.
You don't know my experience, and you don't know my understanding. So,
all right, guys, let's get to the point.
Yeah. Come on.
The point is that there's so many issues to consider here. I don't think that the technological advancements alone are the answer, and here's the reason. At a moment's blink, our technological superiority could be taken out by EMP. Our country could be blind. Many of our systems are not hardened. Our whole dependence on a new electric strategy, electric vehicles, and all that runs right into that whole strategy. What we discovered about the Soviet fighters was interesting back in the day because many of them had tube technology rather than electronic technology. And the reason that was different for those systems were more hardened than our own. Our systems are vulnerable, and they have been, and they will be, until we make some sort of decisions that will prevent that vulnerability. And so, look what happened to Israel. Hamas used low tech strategies to pull off this attack. We know that they deliberately targeted civilians and children and beheaded atrocities. These things were all planned by them. They did it on purpose, right? And for whatever reason, I mean, it's like stupid. Why don't we do this? And then it's going to. And so the people that are being asked to flee Gaza right now, it's not because they want to dislocate them. They don't want to bomb the hell out of them. They don't want them to die. And when they go in to destroy Hamas, which deserves to be destroyed, they've declared war on an independent country. They deserve to have to pay the price of having declared that war. But right now in the United States, we have one strategy, and that is to fund the military-industrial complex, and that goes to the idea of corporate greed and corporate malfeasance and political dysfunction. And I think that's the biggest problem with our military-industrial complex and the funding mechanisms, K Street, other things, and the corruption that goes with it. It's just endemic of our whole political system right now. And the reason why we don't have a coherent strategy is because our government is owned by so many foreign sources right now. There's no way for us to protect our people because our politicians aren't really serving the American public.
Right now, our electoral system is, sorry, go ahead.
EMT, which is electronic magnetic pulse, is a real threat. There's no question. And we're not adequately protected against that. Let me mention a couple of things and I'll turn it over to Rick. Having been chairman of the audit committee of the United Nations, I can tell you that the United Nations has been anti-Israel for a long time. And Israel's one country. It's a Jewish state. There are a lot of other countries that don't like that. I think there are fundamental differences between what Hamas did and what Israel is doing. In the case of Hamas, yes, you're correct. They did low tech because Israel relied too much on tech. And so they went low tech. So tech doesn't always get you what you want, right? But they planned this for a considerable period of time. They did it on a Sabbath. They intentionally targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. They engaged in atrocities that are just hard to believe that anybody would do, if you will, specifically against people who were Jewish. And now what's happening is, in my personal view, the response needs to be two things: neutralize Hamas and penalize Iran.
Yep.
On the neutralizing Hamas, you have to keep in mind that we there were times that we had to end up using war strategies that we were uncomfortable with. And probably the biggest notable example was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where we dropped leaflets and said, get out. All right. And we did that because we don't want to intentionally target civilians or innocent people. Israel's trying to do the same thing. Hamas tries to use civilians as human shields. And so what they're trying to do is to say, get out, because we're going to do what we have to do to neutralize Hamas. And let's just hope that this thing doesn't end up spreading to where Hezbollah comes in from the north, and that we may have to get more actively engaged than otherwise we are right now. And let's also remember what the Bible says, that Armageddon starts in the Middle East. Now, let's hope we never see that.
Hamas is only about 1% of the population
That's right.
of Gaza.
Yeah.
I mean, plenty of people, half of the population sympathize and supports Hamas, but the actual fighters are not. That's about 10, 20,000 people out of 2 million. It's
100,000.
impossible to, I mean, Hamas should be made illegal the way Germany made Nazism illegal after World War II with, and the U.S. occupiers. And Israel's never really done an occupation correctly the way we occupied Germany and Japan, rebuilding. Right now is the stick phase, beating the heck out of Gaza. But then there's the carrot phase where the world would be very willing to throw a ton of money at Gaza to make it nice if that would help guarantee that Gazans wouldn't do periodic massacres.
I understand. Let me mention,
Well, the tough
not,
part is-
not all Palestinians are Hamas. Obviously, it's a very small subset of that. But let me remind you what the United States and the Allies did during World War II. We flattened certain cities.
Yep.
Flattened them, including with firebombing, including most example Dresden. So,
Yep.
I think you got to learn from history. You got to learn from others. I think they need to neutralize Hamas, and we need to penalize Iran.
And with
Well,
that, we're
David,
going to wait till next week because we're out of time, but we want to thank our panelists and the Honorable David M. Walker. Our discussion on the economic budget of the Defense Department, of course, moving into the wars in Israel or conflicts in Israel and Ukraine. We'll see you next week on economics. Till then, have a good week.
Take care.